That's what's so disheartening is that, even in Deus Ex, a game like that where you're essentially being watched everywhere you go, uh, you still can find a way to get away from everything, right? Somehow you can manage to hide, even though, they know where you're at when it's plot relevant, right? When you get an info link or whatever, but it's like clearly it's not that reliable. But no such luck in the real world human prison reality. So, I don't know. In my, fruitless, pointless, whatever, vain attempt to find any sort of, at the very least, escapism. Sometimes it works. Sometimes for a little while you'll go into a flow state. And anytime, I realize I'm in a flow state, I just let myself just appreciate it while it's happening, understanding that it's ephemeral. But, in my vain attempt to just get away from everything, at least, kind of, mentally, if nothing else. So I've been replaying Deus Ex. I haven't replayed Invisible War yet, but I will eventually, probably, if it'll work. But also have been watching videos on the ps2 version called Deus Ex, subtitled The Conspiracy, which is the first way I played the game back in 2002 when I was 11. Very same year I played that, I also played Half-Life 1 on PS2, Red Faction on PS2, Metal Gear Solid 2. A lot of pretty heavy-hitting kind of, socio-political, you know, kind of philosophical type of stuff. It's like, pretty heavy shit for an 11-year-old. And if you're a, kind of intellectual individual, that shit'll stick with you even if you don't really understand it yet. And, being intellectual doesn't, in a non-pejorative sense, doesn't mean that you know big words or any bullshit like that. It just means you actually think about shit. I mean, humans, like I said, they'll usurp everything. So them saying intellectual or thinker or whatever is always bullshit. But, you know, even if you see shit like that, even at an age where you really don't understand what it's telling you, it'll stick with you. My main issue is I wish I had understood when I was 11 what exactly these games were demonstrating to me, right? But until you've seen where humans have taken things at right this point, you would never think that that shit could have been anything other than fictional. But I first played Deus Ex as the PS2 version. I played PS2 version in 2002. And then 2003, when Invisible War came out, I played it first on original Xbox. But what's interesting is I have more memory of Invisible War because I actually owned it. Actually, I think I still have the disc somewhere. The problem with Deus Ex PS2 version, right? Deus Ex: The Conspiracy, is that I only played it once, literally one single time, 24 fucking years ago. So I'm pretty sure it would, pretty sure I rented it at Blockbuster. So my memory of it is very faint, and occasionally I'll go back and watch like long play or walkthrough or whatever you want to call it, stuff about it. Apparently there's not really any speed runs of it, which I guess I'm not too surprised. But, it's one of those games where simultaneously there's way more differences with it than I remember. But at the same time, there's a lot of differences that I don't remember. And whenever I look at the comparison to the PC version video or just the playthrough video, there's always this shit I see and I'm like, oh yeah. Right, like for an example, one of them I was watching a minute ago, whenever you go to meet Stan Dowd for the first time at the burned down Osgood's building, it looks way different in the PS2 version. I mean, most of the areas, in the PS2 version looks significantly different. Like Smuggler's Hideout, or like the sewers a bit, um, like where MJ12 is, or just New York City in general. That whole hub area looks a lot different. Hong Kong, in a lot of ways, looks a lot different. The layout of it is way different than I remember. But it's just interesting to see. Like, for an example, so I have tons of Mandela effect, or like false memories, whatever you want to call it, due to this. So not just me having false memories that conflate the console and PC versions of a lot of these games. Because, like, for an example, I played Half-Life 1 for the first time on PS2 in 2002. In 2003, when I had a PC good enough to play the PC version, I got the second edition on Platinum Collection. And then I played the games on PC. So I played both versions pretty close together. And like in the case of Half-Life 1, for example, and you can go play PS2 mod on the PC version to see these differences now. For an example, in On a Rail, near the end of it, before you get to the rocket area, you have to go through this vent into like a little kind of like maintenance room, and you actually come out kind of like surprising the three dudes that are at the end of the tram rail. Now, in the original version, you ride the tram into that area. In the PS2 version, though, it's blocked off and you have to go through that maintenance room. So that's something, like, when I play the PC version, I always falsely remember that being there. But I also falsely remember it being an optional route. Probably because I played the PS2 version over 20 years ago. Again, just like the Deus Ex PS2 version as a rental. So basically one single time. And, conflating the two, I also mistakenly remembered that secondary route being an option to ambush those guys. But no, in the PS2 version, you actually have to go that way. Well, there's a lot of shit like that in Deus Ex on the PS2 version. So one of the false memories I always have of Deus Ex on the PC version that always gets me tripped up is I always falsely remember the flooded part of the tunnel, where there's this dead scientist that you can get an AUG upgrade canister from. There's like some Karkians swimming around in that area, and it's like near the back entrance to Verse Life, I think. I always falsely remember that part being a part of the little tunnel area where the triads have their little fight at the start. It's like a few on either side, and it's like you don't even have to see it, but if you go down there, you can see them like run at each other with swords, right? I always remember those two parts being basically one level, and every time I play the PC version, I basically get reminded that they're not. But the reason I always remember that is because in the PS2 version, they are connected, which would make sense for them to be connected. I don't know why they're not in the original, but it also makes sense for the PS2 version for them to be connected because the areas aren't that big in the first place. And, the PS2 had such atrocious loading times that it makes more sense to staple them together like that. Every time I rewatch, like that's another thing I forgot about the PS2 version of Deus Ex, is how different the models look. And also, like, the motion captured animations that they added. I always forget about that shit. A lot of the characters look weird. JC, Leo Gold, Anna Navarro, they just all look kind of bizarre. The motion captured animations look out of place. Especially on some characters, like Anna has just this casual walking animation, and she doesn't move like you would expect a mech to like walk around, and it just ends up looking kind of odd. But due to the architecture of the PS2, low video memory, but like high triangle throughput naturally. That means the textures are lower resolution. But just like the PS2 version of Half-Life 1, the textures are higher resolution, but then also the models are higher polygon. And that's how you get, these sort of, you know, questionable things like the HD models in the PS2 version that predate their addition via Blue Shift in the PC version. Different shit like that. Yeah, it's a very, very strange combination and really just helps indicate a particular era of console gaming. Sort of like Invisible War, and why I think Invisible War. So, some of the developers that worked on the PS2 version of the first game basically did the development from the very beginning of Invisible War. And whenever you compare the two, it really makes sense why it turned out how it did. Like a lot of the concessions made for the PS2 version of the first game basically just become the gameplay of Invisible War. So, like for an example, you can no longer guess keypad codes or whatever, or just memorize them. You have to find the information first. A lot of the simplifications and this and that. And I'm not necessarily a huge fan of that stuff, but you can tell they used their experience on the first game to really make the most out of the limitations of the original Xbox. So again, kind of standard idea, you know, the levels are a lot smaller and restricted just from the very start. But one of the things I like about it is that because of that limitation, they also try to compensate for that by making every particular area a lot denser. Like not just visually, but also on the level of the interactivity. And I would say that's one of the things that really uh, gives me a personal preference for Invisible War over the original game in a lot of ways. Is because I've just always been a fan of that. Having these little small areas to really just kind of, pick apart, right? And like when I first played Half-Life on the PS2 as a kid, the level of interactivity stuff blew my mind, right? It's like you could press every button on a microwave, or press the button on the vending machine and the soda came out, right? Or just all these just really kind of basic things that I guess maybe are kind of mundane overall, but the ability to interact with a video game like that for whatever reason, even today, fascinates me. Like when games will have little stuff like a progress bar that you have to wait for it to open a door or like whatever, and like the view kind of like shifts around as it's happening to kind of like emulate like they're doing something. And it's not like an overt animation, but just something about it is just so compelling to me. And that was a big selling point of Invisible War for me. Having these, air vent passageways or little hideouts or this or that. Kind of like Condemned Criminal Origins or like Blood 2 before it. Like, with Monolith Games. Like these hideouts and different ways of exploring these small but densely compacted uh, with interactivity kind of areas. Invisible War is just a personal thing that has a ton of appeal to me, and it is kind of unfortunate having to play it on a modern system where the load times are agonizing. It could easily take several minutes, but that's just a byproduct of the hardware and operating systems that the game was originally designed for, because it never did that on XP or even really Windows 7. Um, and that's the main thing that gets in the way of my replays of Invisible War nowadays. But yeah, I don't really have a way to wrap up my ideas on that or whatever. But yeah, in my own level designs, just as a hobby, I always do stuff really densely compacted, kind of smaller areas, but with a ton of interactivity and stuff to find and like secrets and shit to explore and shit like that. I just always thought shit like that was cool, and yeah, I definitely wouldn't mind getting to be 12 or 13 years old again and get to play Invisible War on the original Xbox, and experience it for the first time again. But whatever. I guess that's just the prison of this fucking technological dystopia, is that there isn't a fucking way out. But whatever.